The year is 479 AD. The Western Roman Empire is dead. Barbarian kings sit on the throne of the Caesars. The eternal city is sacked. The aqueducts run dry. The legions are gone. History tells us this is the fall of Rome. But history is only half right. Look further east. Rome did not fall. It simply relocated. It adapted. It survived. For another 1,000 years, the Roman Empire lived on. We call it the Byzantine Empire. They called themselves Romans. How did they do it? How did the East survive the exact same storms that drowned the West? The answer starts 2 centuries before the West collapsed. It begins in the fires of the 3rd century. Rome was tearing itself apart. The empire was simply too big. It stretched from the misty bogs of Britain to the scorching sands of Syria. One emperor could not be everywhere. Invaders poured across the Rhine. The Persians hammered the eastern frontier. Generals murdered emperors. Then the generals murdered each other. 50 men claimed the throne in just 50 years. The economy was in ruins. Plague ravaged the cities. Rome was on life support. Then came Diocletian. He was a ruthless soldier from Dalmatia. He seized supreme power in 284 AD. Diocletian looked at the bleeding empire. He saw the fatal flaw. Rome was too vast for one man to rule, so he did the unthinkable. He sliced the empire in half. He created the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. 2 senior emperors, 2 junior emperors. They divided the map. Diocletian took the east. He left the west to his co-emperor. This was a massive paradigm shift. The city of Rome was suddenly sidelined. Diocletian ruled from Nicomedia. This was in modern-day Turkey. He saw where the real power lay. The East was the true engine of the empire. Why the East? It was simple mathematics. The East had the people. It had the money. It had the infrastructure. The West was mostly rural. It was filled with dense forests and scattered villas. The East was highly urbanized. It was a network of ancient, wealthy cities. Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus. These cities pumped endless tax revenue into the imperial treasury. The East controlled the vital trade routes. Silks and spices flowed in from India and China. Grain flowed out of Egypt. The East could afford massive armies. It could afford massive walls. It could afford to bribe its enemies. The West could not. Diocletian knew this. He drew a line in the sand. He built a bureaucratic firewall. He ensured the East could govern itself. But the Tetrarchy did not last. Civil war returned. Out of the chaos rose a new visionary, Constantine the Great. Constantine defeated his rivals. He reunified the empire. But he did not return to Rome. He agreed with Diocletian. The future belonged to the East. Constantine needed a new capital, a city untainted by old republican traditions, a city built for a Christian emperor. He found the perfect spot. It was an ancient Greek colony called Byzantium. It sat on the Bosphorus Strait. This was the ultimate geographic choke point. It bridged Europe and Asia. It linked the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. In 330 AD, he consecrated this new capital. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome, but the world would soon know it by another name, Constantinople. Constantine poured the empire's wealth into his new city. He built grand forums. He built massive bathhouses. He built a new senate. He stripped the old world of its monuments to decorate the new one. He shifted the entire center of gravity away from Italy. This was the masterstroke. Diocletian drew the administrative blueprint. Constantine poured the concrete foundation. Together, they engineered a masterful survival strategy. They accepted that the West was a sinking ship. They loaded the empire's treasures, its laws, and its legions into a new, unsinkable vessel. The Great Divide was complete. The East was now fortified, funded, and focused. The Eastern Roman Empire was ready to outlast antiquity. Geography is destiny. For the Eastern Roman Empire, destiny was a triangular peninsula jutting into the sea. This was Constantinople, the queen of cities. It was the ultimate geopolitical jackpot. To the north lay the Golden Horn. It was a deep, natural harbour. To the south, the Sea of Marmara. And to the east, the Bosphorus Strait. This narrow ribbon of water separated Europe from Asia. It was the great toll booth of the ancient world. Every ship moving between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea had to pass through. They brought grain. They brought gold. They brought slaves and spices. Constantinople grew rich just by existing. But wealth attracts wolves. By the early 5th century, the Roman world was crumbling. Goths, Vandals, and Huns were tearing through the West. Rome itself was vulnerable. The East needed a shield. It needed an absolute guarantee of survival. Enter the Theodosian Walls. They were commissioned under Emperor Theodosius II. But the true mastermind was his Praetorian prefect, Anthemios. He saw the barbarian storm gathering. He knew the old walls of Constantine were not enough. The city had grown. The threats had evolved. Anthemios designed a masterpiece of military engineering. He built a defense in depth. It was not just one wall. It was a terrifying, layered gauntlet. Any attacking army first met a massive moat. It was 20 meters wide. It was 10 meters deep. It could be flooded at a moment's notice. Just crossing it was a nightmare under heavy fire. If an enemy survived the moat, they faced the outer wall. It stood 9 meters high. It was studded with defensive towers. Archers rained arrows down on the trapped attackers. But the true nightmare was yet to come. Behind the outer wall loomed the inner wall. It was a colossal beast of stone. It towered 12 meters into the sky. It was 5 meters thick. Massive hexagonal and octagonal towers guarded it. They stood 20 meters high. They provided overlapping fields of fire. There were 96 of these monstrous towers in total. An attacking army was caught in a deadly kill zone. They were slaughtered from above, from the front, and from the flanks. The construction materials were just as brilliant. The Romans used a technique called opus mixtum. They laid thick blocks of limestone. Then they added layers of flat, red Roman brick. This was not just for show. The brick courses acted as shock absorbers. Constantinople sits on a major fault line. Earthquakes were a constant terror. In the year 447, a massive quake struck the city. Entire sections of the new walls collapsed. 57 towers fell to the ground. Panic swept through the streets. Attila the Hun was marching toward the city. The timing could not have been worse. But the citizens of Constantinople did not break. They mobilized. The The bitter rivalries of the chariot racing factions were set aside. The blues and the greens worked side by side. They cleared the rubble. They rebuilt the walls. They dug the massive outer moat. They accomplished this impossible feat in just 60 days. When Attila arrived, he took one look at the rebuilt fortifications. He turned his army around. The walls had defeated the scourge of God without a single sword being drawn. The land was secure, but the sea needed defending too. Formidable sea walls wrapped around the coastline. They protected against naval assaults. And then there was the Golden Horn. The city's vital harbor needed absolute protection. The Byzantines forged a massive iron chain. It was stretched across the mouth of the harbor. Massive wooden barrels kept it afloat. When an enemy fleet approached, the chain was raised. It ripped the hulls out of enemy ships. It locked the harbor down completely. Constantinople became a fortress without equal. It was the ultimate safe room of the ancient and medieval world. Avars, Persians, Arabs, and Bulgars would all come. They would all hurl their armies against the limestone and brick. They would all fail. For 1,000 years, the queen of cities stood defiant. The Theodosian Walls did not just protect a city. They protected an entire civilization. They gave the Eastern Roman Empire the ultimate luxury. They gave it time. Time to scheme. Time to trade. Time to survive. Survival is rarely cheap. While the Western Roman Empire collapsed into a localized barter economy, the East took a different path. They built an economic juggernaut. The secret to Byzantine longevity was not just high walls. It was cold, hard cash. Constantinople was the undisputed financial capital of the medieval world. It was a city where gold flowed like water. At the heart of this financial empire was a single coin, the solidus, known to the wider world as the bezant. Introduced by Constantine the Great, this gold coin was a masterpiece of economic stability. For over 700 years, its weight and purity remained completely unchanged. It was struck from pure 24-carat gold. There was no debasement. There was no inflation. The bezant became the universal currency of the Mediterranean. It was the absolute gold standard. Merchants from London to Baghdad demanded payment in bezants. It was the United States dollar of the Middle Ages. The Byzantine emperors guarded the integrity of this coin with absolute ruthlessness. Forging the bezant was a crime punishable by death. Mutilation was the lighter sentence. This strict control gave the empire something invaluable, ultimate economic credibility. But you need more than a good coin to build a superpower. You need trade, and Constantinople had the greatest real estate on earth. It sat directly on the Bosphorus Strait. It was the ultimate toll booth between Europe and Asia. Every merchant ship traveling between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean had to pass through its waters. Every caravan traveling the western edge of the Silk Road eventually met Byzantine customs agents. The empire controlled the flow of the world's most precious commodities: spices from India, ivory from Africa, furs from the frozen Rus, and above all, silk from China. For centuries, the Roman world bled gold to buy silk. Persia controlled the overland routes. They charged extortionate markups. But Emperor Justinian changed the game. In the 6th century, he dispatched 2 monks to the east. They played the role of holy men, but they were actually corporate spies. They smuggled live silkworms inside hollow bamboo canes. They brought them safely back to Constantinople. This single act of espionage broke the Persian monopoly forever. Byzantium launched its own state-run silk industry. Imperial factories produced purple-dyed silks of staggering beauty. These fabrics were restricted by law. Only the emperor could wear them. Only the emperor could gift them. Silk became a diplomatic weapon. A well-timed gift of imperial silk could buy the loyalty of a barbarian king faster than an army of legionaries. The Byzantine economy was centralized to an almost modern degree. Nothing escaped the eye of the state. The prefect of the city, known as the eparch, regulated every market. He controlled the guilds. He set the prices. He determined the exact profit margins for bakers, butchers, and jewelers. Free trade did not exist here. This was a command economy designed to feed the imperial treasury, and the treasury was always hungry. The state levied a strict 10% tax on all imports and exports. This tax was called the commercion. Customs houses dotted the frontiers. Tax collectors were notoriously efficient. They squeezed wealth from every single transaction. This relentless centralization generated unimaginable revenues. The emperor used this wealth to buy survival. When the walls needed repair, the treasury paid the engineers. When the army needed elite heavy cavalry, the treasury bought the finest armor. And when a barbarian horde appeared on the horizon, the treasury simply bought them off. Bribes were often much cheaper than war. The Byzantine Empire did not just outfight its enemies. It outspent them. The Bezant and the Silk Road provided the fuel. They kept the engine of Eastern Rome running for 1,000 years. Byzantium did not survive on walls alone. They needed to fight, but they fought differently than the old Roman legions. Manpower was precious. They could not afford to waste lives in bloody wars of attrition. Victory meant survival, not just glory. So they fought smart. They relied on science. They relied on overwhelming shock tactics. They turned warfare into a brutal, highly calculated art form. Let us talk about the ultimate medieval superweapon, Greek fire. It was a closely guarded state secret. A weapon so terrifying, it literally changed the course of history. In the 7th century, the Islamic Caliphate was an unstoppable juggernaut. They swept across the Middle East. They took Egypt. They took Syria. In the year 674, their massive fleet reached Constantinople. The empire was on the brink of total annihilation. Enter Callinicos. He was a refugee architect from Syria. He brought a formula to the emperor. It was a recipe for liquid death. The Byzantines mounted bronze tubes on the prows of their warships. These fast, agile galleys were called dromons. When the Arab fleet closed in, the Byzantines unleashed hell. A pressurized jet of liquid shot across the water. It erupted into roaring, violent flames. But this was no ordinary fire. It burned on water. It clung to wood. It stuck to human flesh. Pouring water on it only made the flames spread faster. The only ways to extinguish it were sand, vinegar, or old urine. The enemy sailors panicked. They abandoned ship. They drowned in their heavy armor to escape the blistering heat. Greek fire saved the empire. It broke the first Arab siege. Decades later, in 717, it did it again. The recipe was guarded with lethal strictness. Only the emperor and a select few engineers knew the formula. It was likely a complex mix of naphtha, pine resin, sulfur, and quicklime. But the exact chemical makeup is lost to time. It remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Naval supremacy, however, was only half the equation. Byzantium needed to dominate the land. They faced endless waves of nomadic horse archers from the steppes. They faced heavily armored infantry from the west. The ancient Roman foot soldier was obsolete. The battlefield had evolved. Cavalry was now king. The Byzantines answered this threat with the cataphract, the ultimate armored shock cavalry. They were the medieval equivalent of a main battle tank. The Greek word itself translates to fully armored, and they truly were. Picture a massive war horse. It is draped in thick felt and boiled ox hide. Sometimes it wears interlocking scale armor. Astride this massive beast sits a giant of a man. He is encased in steel from head to toe. He wears a heavy lamellar cuirass called a clivanion. His face is hidden behind a chainmail veil. This rider was a master of combined arms. He carried a deadly composite bow. He could rain armor-piercing arrows on the enemy from a distance. But his primary weapon was the kontos, a massive wooden lance, over 12 feet long. When the enemy ranks wavered, the cataphracts charged. They rode in a tight, wedge-shaped formation. The ground shook beneath their hooves. The impact was utterly devastating. The kontos would shatter enemy shields. It had the power to skewer 2 men at once. Once the lance broke, the rider drew a heavy iron mace, or he wielded a curved cavalry sword called a paramerion. They smashed through enemy lines with brutal mechanical efficiency. Yet weapons alone do not win wars. The mind is the greatest weapon of all. The Byzantines treated warfare as an academic science. They wrote extensive military manuals. The most famous is the Strategikon, attributed to Emperor Maurice. Later came the Tactica of Leo the Wise. These texts were highly pragmatic. They stripped away the toxic vanity of war. They studied their enemies meticulously. They learned exactly how the Franks fought. They learned how the Persians charged. They learned how the Slavs ambushed in the forests. And they developed highly specific counter-tactics for each and every foe. The generals used feigned retreats to break enemy discipline. They used complex ambushes. They deployed highly organized logistics trains. Every soldier had a specific role. Every unit had dedicated medical corpsmen. They valued tactical retreats over heroic last stands. A dead soldier could not fight tomorrow. This was the true Byzantine way of war. It was ruthless. It was calculating. It was technologically superior. They combined the blinding terror of Greek fire with the crushing weight of the cataphract. They paired heavy armor with supreme intellect. This deadly, unmatched synthesis kept the enemies of Eastern Rome at bay for 1,000 blood-soaked years. Swords break, shields shatter, armies bleed. But a well-placed bribe? That lasts a lifetime. The Byzantine Empire did not survive 1,000 years on brute force alone. They survived through cunning. They survived through deception. They survived by inventing the world's first formal intelligence agency. They called it the Scrinion ton Barbaran, the Bureau of Barbarians. It was a masterpiece of statecraft, a shadowy department nestled deep within the imperial palace in Constantinople. Here, clerks did not just push paper. They gathered secrets. They mapped the bloodlines of foreign kings. They tracked the bitter rivalries of nomadic warlords. They studied the religious taboos of distant tribes. Knowledge was their primary weapon, and they wielded it with lethal precision. To the Byzantines, war was a failure of imagination. War was brutally expensive. War was dangerously unpredictable. Why risk 10,000 Roman lives when a chest of gold could solve the problem? Why fight a fierce enemy when you could pay their neighbor to fight them instead? This was the core of Byzantine grand strategy. Divide, distract, destroy from within. Imagine a horde of pechenegs massing on the Danube frontier. A traditional Roman emperor of the old days might march out to meet them in open battle. A Byzantine emperor simply checked his ledgers. The Bureau of Barbarians would quickly identify a rival tribe further east, perhaps the Cumans. Gold would quietly change hands. Exquisite silk robes would be gifted. Heavy silver bowls would be presented. Suddenly, the pechenegs found themselves attacked from the rear. The immediate threat to Constantinople vanished overnight. Not a single Byzantine sword was drawn. When foreign envoys did visit the capital, the Bureau orchestrated a brilliant theater of power. It was pure psychological warfare. Ambassadors were led through dimly lit, incense-filled corridors. They were deliberately made to wait. They were made to feel utterly insignificant. Finally, they entered the grand throne room of the Magnaura. Mechanical golden lions roared. Artificial birds sang in golden trees. The emperor sat elevated on the throne of Solomon. Hidden machinery lifted the throne high into the air. It was terrifying. It was awe-inspiring. Envoys returned home absolutely convinced that fighting Byzantium meant fighting God himself. But gold and smoke were not the only tools. The Byzantines weaponized prestige. They handed out grand-sounding titles to barbarian warlords. A rugged chieftain could suddenly call himself a patrician of Rome. It stroked their massive egos. It tied their political legitimacy directly to the emperor. And then there was the ultimate diplomatic prize: marriage. A Byzantine princess born in the purple chamber, a porphyrogenitor. Giving a Roman princess to a foreign king was exceptionally rare. It was highly controversial among the elite. But when the empire's very survival hung in the balance, it secured unbreakable alliances. It brought fierce enemies into the Byzantine family. Vladimir the Great of the Kievan Rus was tamed exactly this way. None of this worked without flawless intelligence. The Bureau of Barbarians managed a vast, invisible network of spies. The logothete of the Drome oversaw this intricate web. Merchants traveling the Silk Road doubled as imperial informants. Priests converting pagans in the frozen north sent back heavily encrypted reports. Translators embedded with foreign embassies listened to every careless whisper. They intercepted private letters. They analyzed subtle trade disruptions. They knew exactly when an enemy was starving. They knew exactly when a rival king was dying. This was the invisible, impenetrable shield of the Eastern Roman Empire, soft power elevated to an absolute art form, state-sponsored espionage executed with ruthless, calculating efficiency. The Western Roman Empire fell because it tried to fight every single barbarian at the gates. The Eastern Roman Empire survived because it invited them in. It gave them a fancy title. It paid them to fight each other. The Bureau of Barbarians proved a fundamental, enduring truth. The sharpest weapon in the Byzantine arsenal was never made of steel. It was always made of information. Imagine trying to govern an empire with 1,000 years of scattered rules, decrees from dead emperors, contradictory judgments, lost scrolls. This was the reality of Roman law by the 6th century. It was a massive, tangled web. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. Judges were constantly confused. Lawyers actively exploited the chaos. The legal system was suffocating the state. To survive, the Eastern Roman Empire needed a radical reset. It needed absolute order. Enter Emperor Justinian. He took the throne in 527. Justinian dreamed of restoring the lost glory of Rome, but he knew swords and shields were never enough. A true empire is built on laws. He understood a vital truth. You cannot project power outward if your foundation is crumbling inward. He wanted one empire. He wanted one religion. And above all, he wanted one unified law. Justinian found the perfect man for the job. His name was Tribonian. He was a brilliant legal scholar. He possessed an encyclopedic mind. Justinian gave him a seemingly impossible task. Read every Roman law ever written. Discard the outdated ones. Fix the glaring contradictions. Condense a millennium of legal history into a single coherent system. Tribonian and his commission worked relentlessly. They sifted through thousands of ancient texts. In just a few years, they achieved a miracle. They produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This was not just a book. It was an absolute legal revolution. It came in distinct parts. First was the Codex. It contained all valid imperial edicts. Next came the Digest. This was a massive compilation of writings from elite Roman jurists. It provided the philosophy behind the laws. Then came the Institutes. This served as a textbook for first-year law students. Justinian was thinking ahead. He was actively training the next generation of bureaucrats. The Justinian Code changed everything. It stripped away regional quirks. It established absolute imperial authority. The emperor became the sole, undisputed source of law, but it also protected the ordinary citizens. It clearly defined property rights. It strictly regulated contracts. It standardized marriage and inheritance. This legal clarity fueled a highly efficient bureaucracy. Western Europe was fracturing into decentralized feudal kingdoms. The West relied on illiterate warlords. Blood feuds determined justice. Trial by ordeal became common. Byzantium completely rejected this. They used formal courts. They used written evidence. They used trained judges. The Eastern Empire did not rely on hereditary nobles. It relied on professional civil servants. This administration was a true meritocracy. A poor boy could rise to immense power if he mastered the law. This created a fiercely loyal class of administrators. They owed their status entirely to the state. This centralized machine was the true engine of Byzantine survival. It allowed the government to collect taxes with ruthless efficiency. Money flowed directly into the imperial treasury. This funded the massive armies. It built the mighty defensive walls. It paid the vital bribes to hostile barbarian kings. A merchant in Constantinople operated under the exact same laws as a farmer in Anatolia. This consistency bred immense economic confidence. It fostered unmatched resilience. Emperors would come and go. Dynasties would violently rise and fall. Assassinations would routinely rock the palace. But the bureaucratic machine never stopped humming. The Justinian Code was the empire's invisible skeleton. It held the vast territory together through plagues, wars, and famines. It was a masterpiece of statecraft. It transformed the Roman legacy from a geographic empire into a lasting legal concept. Long after Justinian died, his laws endured. They weathered the darkest centuries of the Middle Ages. Centuries later, a copy of the Digest was rediscovered in Italy. It ignited a massive legal renaissance in Western Europe. The Justinian Code became the absolute bedrock of modern civil law. Today, from Paris to Tokyo, legal systems still clearly echo the brilliant work of Tribonian. Justinian did not just save Byzantine administration. He wrote the foundational operating system for the modern state. Imagine walking into the great palace of Constantinople. You are a foreign ambassador. You have traveled for months across dangerous terrain. You finally enter the Magnara. The imperial throne room is utterly overwhelming. At the center sits the Byzantine emperor, but he does not look like a mortal man. He looks like a living, breathing icon. He is draped head to toe in Tyrian purple. This legendary dye is worth more than its weight in gold. Beside him stand twin golden lions. They are mechanical marvels. They roar and beat their heavy tails against the floor. Above the throne sits a massive golden tree. Artificial birds sing complex melodies from its glittering branches. You fall to your knees in absolute prostration. When you finally dare to look up, the emperor has vanished. Moments later, he reappears. He is now hovering high above the floor. The throne has been silently hoisted into the air by hidden pulleys. He wears a completely different, even more dazzling robe. You are terrified. You are awestruck. And that is exactly the point. The Byzantine emperor was never merely a head of state. He was God's vicegerent on earth. He was the literal earthly reflection of the heavenly ruler. The Byzantines called him Isapostolos. This translates to equal to the apostles. This title carried an unimaginable psychological weight. In the West, kings constantly squabbled with popes over authority. In the East, the emperor and the Orthodox Church operated in a delicate, powerful harmony. They called this unifying concept Symphonia. The emperor defended the physical borders of the faith. The Patriarch of Constantinople guided the eternal souls of the citizens. But make no mistake about the hierarchy. The emperor held the ultimate trump card. He called the ecumenical councils. He appointed the patriarchs. He was the absolute pinnacle of the earthly order. This divine right to rule was a massive survival tool. The Byzantine Empire was incredibly vast and diverse. It held Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, and Syrians. They spoke different native languages. They held entirely different local customs. How do you keep such a fractured, sprawling population together? You give them a shared, unshakable identity. That identity was Orthodox Christianity. To be Roman in the East meant to be Orthodox. The faith was the absolute glue of the empire. It penetrated every single layer of daily life. It dictated the civic calendar. It inspired the breathtaking art. It fueled the imperial armies. When Byzantine soldiers marched into battle, they did not just fight for territory. They fought for the Virgin Mary. They carried massive icons of warrior saints into the vanguard. Defending the empire was completely synonymous with defending the kingdom of God. This intense religious fervor provided incredible psychological resilience. It made the state practically indestructible from within. Think about the profound implications. If the emperor is handpicked by God, rebellion is not just a political crime. Treason becomes literal heresy. To plot against the throne was to plot against the divine order of the universe. Of course, emperors were overthrown. Violent usurpations absolutely happened. But the usurper always had to claim a new divine mandate. The office of the emperor remained utterly sacred, even if the man occupying the throne was deeply flawed. Nowhere was this sacred union more visible than inside the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. It was the architectural and spiritual heartbeat of the empire. When you stepped inside, the physical world simply melted away. The massive central dome seemed suspended by a golden chain from heaven itself. 4 acres of gold mosaics reflected the flickering light of 10,000 oil lamps. Heavy incense clouded the air. Choirs chanted in haunting, echoing harmonies. Here, the emperor and the patriarch stood side by side. They performed elaborate rituals that perfectly blended statecraft with salvation. The emperor even partook of the Eucharist behind the iconostasis. He confidently crossed the strict boundary between layman and priest. This was the ultimate Byzantine survival strategy. They built a society where heaven and earth were inextricably linked. The state bureaucracy was heavily centralized. But the Orthodox faith was the true anchor. It gave the poorest Anatolian farmer and the wealthiest capital aristocrat a shared cosmic purpose. Foreign enemies could batter the massive walls of Constantinople. Plagues could ravage the distant provinces. But the Byzantine worldview remained absolute and unbroken. They were God's chosen people. Their emperor was God's chosen ruler. As long as they kept the true faith, the empire could never truly fall. This profound divine confidence forged an impenetrable psychological armor. It allowed Eastern Rome to weather devastating storms that would have shattered any secular kingdom. The year is 636. The dust settles over the Yarmouk River. The Eastern Roman Empire suffers a catastrophic, world-altering defeat. The rise of the Islamic caliphates changes the map overnight. A new, unstoppable force pours out of the Arabian Peninsula. The Byzantine army is shattered. Syria falls. The Levant falls. Jerusalem is lost. Soon the crown jewel of Egypt is taken. The empire loses its richest provinces. It loses its primary breadbasket. It loses millions of taxpayers. The treasury is completely drained. The empire shrinks to a fraction of its former size. Enemies press in heavily from all sides. The old Roman ways are failing fast. The massive professional standing armies of antiquity are entirely too expensive to maintain. Total collapse seems absolutely inevitable. But Byzantium refuses to die. Desperate times demand incredibly radical measures. The emperors in Constantinople realize a harsh, undeniable truth. The old system is completely dead. Centuries ago, Emperor Diocletian strictly separated military and civil power. That system worked beautifully for a sprawling, wealthy empire. But this is now a desperate fight for sheer survival. The empire needs a brand new shield. They need a system that costs a fraction of the price, but fights twice as hard. Enter the theme system. It is a total ground-up reorganization of the state. It becomes the ultimate Byzantine survival mechanism. The word thema originally meant a military regiment. Now it becomes the name of a province. The remaining heartland of Anatolia is carved up into massive military districts: the Anatolikon, the Armeniakon, the Opsikion. Each theme is placed under the absolute, unquestioned control of a strategos. He is a military general with supreme local power. Civil and military authority are brutally fused back together. Bureaucratic red tape is entirely slashed. When Arab raiding parties cross the border, the strategos does not wait for a courier from the capital. He acts instantly. But the true genius of the theme system lies in the soldiers themselves. The state can no longer afford to pay heavy gold to mercenaries or full-time troops, so they pay them with dirt. Soldiers are granted plots of land to farm. In exchange, they owe strict hereditary military service to the empire. The soldier becomes a farmer. The farmer becomes a soldier. This radically changes the entire psychology of warfare. These men are no longer fighting for a distant, unseen emperor in Constantinople. They are not fighting for a meager paycheck. They are fighting for their own homes. They are defending their own wives, their own children, and their own crops. If the front line falls, their own fields will burn. This creates a highly motivated, localized defense force. The Byzantines completely abandon the idea of pitching massive, risky battles against superior numbers. Instead, they adopt a brilliant strategy of defense in depth. When massive Arab raiding parties cross the rugged Taurus Mountains, the local thematic soldiers do not rush out to meet them in open combat. They retreat. They evacuate the civilian population into fortified mountain strongholds. They take all their valuable livestock with them. They scorch the earth and let the invaders exhaust themselves. They wait patiently. Then they strike with lethal precision. They ambush the enemy in narrow mountain passes. They cut off vital supply lines. They bleed the invaders utterly dry on the journey home. The theme system saves the empire from complete annihilation. It transforms a crumbling, bankrupt superpower into a hardened, highly resilient fortress. It anchors the Byzantine state for the next 4 centuries. The heartbreaking loss of Egypt and Syria was a tragedy for the Romans, but it forced the empire to urgently adapt. Anatolia becomes the new iron core of Byzantium. It provides both the necessary food and the fierce fighters. The sprawling state bureaucracy shrinks down, but it becomes incredibly efficient. The theme system proves a vital lesson. True survival is never about stubbornly holding on to the past. It is about ruthlessly adapting to the present. The Eastern Romans boldly reinvented themselves. They traded the sprawling, paid legions of antiquity for the fiercely loyal, land-owning frontiersmen of the Middle Ages, and in doing so, they successfully bought their empire hundreds of years of glorious life. History hangs by a very thin thread, or rather, a fragile sheet of papyrus. In the West, the Roman Empire collapsed. The great cities emptied out. The ancient libraries burned to the ground. The accumulated wisdom of antiquity faced absolute annihilation. The Dark Ages swallowed the light of classical thought. But in the East, the lights stayed on. Constantinople became the ultimate vault. It was a fortress not just for people, but for human thought. The Byzantines did not just survive the collapse of the ancient world, they remembered it. They became the absolute keepers of antiquity. Consider the Imperial Library of Constantinople. It was founded in the 4th century. The Emperor Constantius II saw the rot spreading across the ancient world. He ordered a massive, state-funded rescue operation. Imperial agents scoured the crumbling cities of the Mediterranean. They hunted down decaying scrolls. They rescued forgotten manuscripts from abandoned temples. They brought them all back to the Queen of Cities. But hoarding the texts was only the first step. Papyrus is incredibly fragile. It rots. It crumbles in the damp coastal air. The Byzantines understood this deadly ticking clock. So they began a monumental technological shift. They painstakingly transferred thousands of texts. They moved them from fragile papyrus scrolls to highly durable parchment codices. They essentially popularized the modern book. This single massive undertaking saved classical literature. Without it, the voices of antiquity would have gone silent forever. The real heroes of this story did not carry swords. They did not wear heavy armor. They wore simple monastic robes. They sat in quiet, sunlit rooms known as scriptoria. These were the scribes. They were monks, scholars, and dedicated civil servants. They spent their entire lives hunched over wooden desks. Their fingers were permanently stained with dark iron gall ink. Copying a single book was a massive undertaking. It took months of grueling, bone-aching labor. The scribes worked by natural light to prevent fire hazards. They copied the epic poetry of Homer. They meticulously duplicated the philosophical treatises of Plato and Aristotle. They preserved the groundbreaking medical genius of Galen. They saved the complex mathematics of Euclid. They protected the astronomical maps of Ptolemy. Crucially, they did not just copy Christian theology. They aggressively protected the pagan masterpieces of their ancient Greek and Roman ancestors. Why did a deeply orthodox Christian empire save pagan philosophy? The answer lies in a powerful cultural concept. They called it paideia. It meant supreme classical education. To be Byzantine was to be highly cultured. It was to speak eloquently, write beautifully, and think deeply. A true Byzantine aristocrat could quote the Bible in one breath and the Iliad in the next. They viewed themselves as the unbroken continuation of Greece and Rome. They were the rightful custodians of human civilization. They absolutely refused to let the past die. When devastating earthquakes struck the capital, the monks kept writing. When foreign armies battered the massive Theodosian Walls, the scribes kept copying. The vital work never stopped. Beyond the capital, heavily fortified monasteries became literal arks of knowledge. Places like the legendary Studios Monastery in Constantinople, or the remote cliffside retreats of Mount Athos. These religious sanctuaries doubled as impenetrable libraries. Inside their thick stone walls, ancient science slept safely. This obsessive preservation directly fueled the empire. Byzantine doctors used ancient surgical texts to heal the sick. Byzantine generals studied ancient military tactics to outsmart new enemies. Byzantine architects used ancient geometry to raise the impossible dome of the Hagia Sophia. Knowledge was their ultimate survival tool. For over 1,000 years, they guarded this intellectual treasure. They kept the brilliant flame of antiquity burning through the absolute darkest centuries of human history. They held the line against ignorance. And when the time was finally right, this hoarded genius would change the world. It would cross heavily guarded borders. It would help spark the Islamic Golden Age. And centuries later, it would flow back into Western Europe. It would directly ignite the Renaissance. The Byzantines saved our collective memory. They preserved the very soul of Western civilization. By the mid-9th century, the Eastern Roman Empire was deeply scarred. It had endured centuries of relentless siege. Arab armies had ripped away Egypt, Syria, and the Levant. Slavic tribes had flooded the Balkans. Internal religious civil wars over sacred icons had torn society apart. Byzantium had survived, but it was a shadow of its former self. It was backed into a tight corner. But corners are dangerous places to trap a Roman. The empire was about to bounce back. It was about to experience a spectacular rebirth. We call it the Macedonian Renaissance. It began with a peasant. Basil I was an illiterate wrestler from Thrace. He ruthlessly murdered his way to the throne in 867. He founded the mighty Macedonian dynasty. Under this new imperial bloodline, the empire stopped retreating. It finally went on the offensive. But this was not just a military revival. It was a massive cultural awakening. The bitter iconoclast controversy was finally over. Sacred images returned to the churches. The intellectual darkness lifted. Emperors began to sponsor mass education. They poured gold into the University of Magnora. Scholars dusted off ancient Greek texts. They rigorously copied the works of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle. They preserved the fragile genius of antiquity. Without these Byzantine scribes, the classical world might have been lost forever. Art flourished like never before. Craftsmen carved exquisite ivory plaques. Painters created masterpieces like the Paris Psalter. This was a manuscript so brilliantly illuminated, it rivaled the greatest art of ancient Rome. Basil I even built the Nea Ecclesia. It was the first monumental church constructed in the capital in centuries. It signaled a bold new era of architectural glory. At the center of this cultural explosion was Emperor Constantine VII. He was known as Porphyrogenitus. This meant born in the purple. Constantine was a dedicated scholar, not a soldier. He wrote massive encyclopedias. He meticulously documented foreign policy, court rituals, and provincial administration. He turned the imperial court into an intellectual powerhouse. But a renaissance requires absolute security. Byzantium needed a shield. It forged a sword instead. The 10th century produced a breed of ruthless, brilliant soldier emperors. They turned the Byzantine army into the most terrifying war machine on earth. First came Nikephoros II Phocas. His terrified enemies called him the White Death of the Saracens. He was a grim, ascetic warrior. He lived entirely for the battlefield. Under his command, the heavily armored Byzantine cavalry smashed through Arab lines. He retook the highly strategic island of Crete. He liberated Cyprus. He even recaptured the great ancient city of Antioch. The tide of Islamic expansion was violently reversed. Then came John I Tzimiskis. He pushed the imperial borders even further south. He marched his armies deep into the Levant. He brought the empire to the very gates of Jerusalem. Byzantium was no longer just surviving. It was conquering. Then came the absolute apex, the zenith of Byzantine power. His name was Basil II. He ruled for nearly half a century. Basil was cold, calculating, and utterly relentless. He ignored the soft luxury of the capital. He spent his life sleeping in harsh military tents. He forged a brilliant diplomatic alliance with the Kievan Rus. He sent his sister Anna to marry Prince Vladimir. In return, he received 6,000 elite Viking mercenaries. They became the legendary Varangian Guard. These giant, axe-wielding warriors served as the emperor's personal bodyguards. They were fiercely loyal. They struck absolute terror into the hearts of Byzantine enemies. Basil's greatest enemy was the First Bulgarian Empire. The Bulgarians had menaced Constantinople for centuries. Basil made it his life's mission to destroy them. He campaigned year after year. He ground the Bulgarian forces down with brutal efficiency. In 1014, he cornered the Bulgarian army at the Battle of Clydon. The Byzantine victory was total, but the aftermath was legendary in its cruelty. Basil captured 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers. He ordered them all blinded. He left every 100th man with one eye. These one-eyed men led the wretched blind army home. The shock allegedly killed the Bulgarian Tsar on the spot. Basil earned a terrifying nickname, the Bulgar Slayer. He annexed Bulgaria entirely. He pushed the imperial frontier all the way back to the Danube River. By the time Basil died in 1025, Byzantium was untouchable. The empire stretched from southern Italy to the mountains of Armenia. It controlled the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Levant. The treasury was overflowing with millions of gold coins. Constantinople was the undisputed center of the world. The Macedonian Renaissance proved a vital historical lesson. Byzantium was not just a stubborn relic of the past. It was a dynamic, highly adaptable superpower. It had stared into the abyss of the Dark Ages. It had fought off total annihilation, and it had emerged stronger, richer, and more dangerous than ever before. For nearly 1,000 years, Constantinople stood unbroken. It was the shield of Europe, the envy of the known world. But the greatest wound dealt to the Eastern Roman Empire did not come from the East. It came from the West. It came from those who called themselves brothers in Christ. The year was 1204. The Fourth Crusade was originally meant to reclaim Jerusalem. Instead, it became a tragedy of epic proportions. A toxic mix of Venetian greed and petty Byzantine dynastic squabbles diverted the Holy Fleet. The Crusaders arrived outside the Queen of Cities. They looked upon unparalleled wealth. They saw gold roofs gleaming in the sun. They saw ancient monuments of unimaginable value, and they wanted it all. The supposedly impregnable city fell. It did not fall to a brilliant foreign siege. It fell to betrayal and internal decay. Western knights poured through the breached sea walls. They unleashed a terrifying torrent of destruction. 3 days of relentless, brutal pillaging followed. Ancient libraries burned to the ground. Priceless bronze statues from antiquity were melted down to mint cheap coins. The Hagia Sophia was the very heart of Orthodox Christianity. It was brutally desecrated. The Crusaders smashed the silver altar. They drank wine from sacred chalices. The Byzantine Empire was instantly shattered into fragmented exile states. The Romans eventually managed to reclaim their capital in 1261. But the damage was terminal. The sacred illusion of invincibility was gone forever. The Byzantine state was now a hollowed-out shadow of its former glory. It was economically crippled beyond repair. The vital maritime trade routes were completely lost. They were now dominated by aggressive Italian maritime republics. Venice and Genoa controlled the flow of wealth. The empire was slowly bleeding out. Bitter civil wars ravaged the remaining countryside. Desperate emperors were forced to pawn the imperial crown jewels. They relied heavily on volatile foreign mercenaries to fight their battles. The infamous Catalan Company was brought in to save the empire. Instead, they viciously turned on their employers. They burned and ravaged the very lands they were paid to protect. Byzantium was literally eating itself alive. While the Romans fought each other, a new, unstoppable power rose in the east. The Ottomans. Under brilliant leaders, this fierce nomadic warrior culture transformed. They became a highly sophisticated, centralized war machine. They slowly swallowed the remaining Byzantine territories in Anatolia. Then they boldly crossed the Hellespont. They entered Europe. The strategic noose was tightening. By the early 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was an empire in name only. It was little more than a fortified city-state. Constantinople was a lonely Christian island in a vast Ottoman sea. Its population had plummeted. The vast, sprawling imperial palaces were left abandoned and decaying. Orchards and wheat fields grew within the city walls, where bustling neighborhoods once stood. Then came the fateful year of 1453. Sultan Mehmed II marched on Constantinople. He brought an immense army of over 100,000 men, but he also brought something far more terrifying, a weapon that would violently change the course of human history: gunpowder. The mighty Theodosian Walls had survived brutal earthquakes. They had repelled massive armies of Avars, Persians, and Arabs. They were the ultimate, invincible defense of late antiquity. But they were absolutely not built for the devastating age of artillery. Mehmed hired a brilliant Hungarian engineer named Orban. Orban cast a monstrous, terrifying bronze cannon. It was over 27 feet long. It fired massive stone balls weighing more than 1,000 pounds. The deafening roar of the bombard shook the earth for miles. It was the terrifying sound of a new era. Day after brutal day, the great cannon pounded the ancient Roman masonry. The invincible walls finally began to shatter. The Roman defenders fought with desperate, heart-breaking heroism. Emperor Constantine XI saw the final breach. He threw off his purple imperial regalia. He drew his sword. He charged headlong into the collapsing rubble. He died fighting alongside his doomed men. The last Roman emperor fell in the dust. The walls finally crumbled. The Queen of Cities was taken. A legendary 1,000-year survival story ended in fire, smoke, and rubble. The Eastern Roman Empire was finally dead. May 29th, 1453. The Theodosian Walls finally break. The last Roman emperor dies fighting in the streets. The Queen of Cities falls to the Ottoman Turks. It sounds like an ending. It looks like the final chapter of a tragic story. But it was actually a beginning. The Byzantine Empire did not truly die on that bloody Tuesday. It scattered. It exploded outward, like seeds caught in a violent wind. And those seeds would grow to change the entire world. Decades before the final siege, the writing was already on the wall. The empire was shrinking. The enemy was closing in. Byzantine intellectuals saw the inevitable. They packed their bags. They boarded merchant ships bound for Italy. And they brought their most precious cargo. It was not gold. It was not silk. It was not spices. It was books. They carried ancient manuscripts meticulously copied by generations of monks. These were works that had been lost to the West for centuries. Western Europe had lost touch with the ancient Greek world. They only knew fragments of classical philosophy. They read Aristotle through flawed translations of translations. The Byzantines brought the pure originals. They brought Homer. They brought Plato. They brought Ptolemy and Sophocles. They brought the unedited, raw brilliance of Greek antiquity. Cities like Florence, Padua, and Venice eagerly absorbed these scholars. They set up academies. They taught the Italian thinkers how to read ancient Greek. This sudden influx of ancient knowledge was the spark. It ignited the intellectual explosion, we now call the Renaissance. Without these fleeing Byzantine refugees, the Renaissance as we know it simply does not happen. The rebirth of the West required the death of the East, but their legacy goes far beyond dusty books and Renaissance art. Look closely at the map of Europe. For exactly 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire stood as a massive armored shield. They absorbed the brutal shock waves of history. They were the great breakwater against which the tides of Eastern conquests crashed. They fought off the Sassanid Persians. They held back the immense, sweeping power of the early Islamic caliphates. They deflected the Seljuk Turks for centuries. They stood firmly at the crossroads of two continents. They took the hits so others did not have to. While Western Europe was fractured, tribal, and vulnerable, Byzantium held the line. They bought the West time. They bought them centuries to rebuild from the ashes of the Dark Ages. They gave them the breathing room to evolve into modern nations. Without the impregnable walls of Constantinople, the cultural and political history of Western Europe would be entirely unrecognizable. The echoes of Eastern Rome are still everywhere today. Look at our modern legal systems. Civil law in much of Europe and the Americas rests directly on the Justinian Code. The Byzantine obsession with centralized bureaucracy created a blueprint for the modern nation-state. They proved that written laws, not just swords, hold a complex society together. Then there is the profound legacy of faith. The Byzantine emperors shaped Eastern Orthodox Christianity. They sent missionaries deep into the harsh Slavic lands. They gave them an alphabet. They gave them a religion. When Constantinople fell, that spiritual mantle moved north. Moscow boldly declared itself the Third Rome. The rituals, the haunting chants, the golden domes of Eastern Europe are fundamentally Byzantine. The double-headed eagle of the Palaiologos dynasty still flies proudly on sovereign flags today. History has often treated the Byzantine Empire as a mere footnote, a slow, agonizing decline, a pale, decadent shadow of classical Rome. But this is a profound historical injustice. They were the ultimate survivors. They took the crumbling ruins of the Roman Empire and forged something entirely new. They engineered impregnable defenses. They weaponized liquid fire. They mastered the dark arts of diplomacy, espionage, and economic warfare. They survived devastating plagues. They survived treacherous crusades. They survived endless, grinding sieges. They did not just outlive the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They outlived it by a staggering 10 centuries. The Byzantium Survival Guide was a masterpiece of human resilience. Eastern Rome may have finally fallen, but its brilliant light never truly went out. It simply illuminated the dawn of the modern world.